The Romans. Why is it every time we imagine them, they seem more like characters from an old movie than real people? Sure, they dressed funny. Their hair was a little long around the ears. But the Romans weren't marble statues with broken noses. In fact, in many ways, they weren't very different from us. Hi, my name is Arizona Smith. As an archaeologist, I try to make sense of a civilization by digging through the bits and pieces the people left behind, kind of like a big jigsaw puzzle. And what I've learned about the Romans makes them seem a lot like you and me. Look around you. I'll bet there are lots of people with different backgrounds. Well, the Romans had one of the first multicultural societies. And when we look at a map, we see why. The Roman Empire stretched all across Europe, North Africa, the Near East. Many different peoples, all contributing to the culture of Rome. But how do we know how these people really lived? Well, with the Romans, we got lucky. Look at this little scene. See how it appears frozen in time? We actually found a whole Roman city preserved like this, looking just as it did in the year 79 AD. In the city of Pompeii, a prosperous trading center in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the 24th of August, 79 AD, began like any other ordinary day. But by the time Mount Vesuvius had finished erupting, Pompeii was buried in about 10 feet of boiling ashes. It would lie there, hidden and undisturbed, for 1,600 years. Starting in 1748, archaeologists began to uncover the city. It was like opening a window to a long-lost world. For much of what we know about Roman daily life comes to us from Pompeii. Wealthy Romans would decorate their homes with beautiful mosaics made of colored chips of stone, marble, and glass. Their walls were covered with murals, often scenes from nature, or mythology, or portraits. Wealthy homes were also built around open courtyards with beautiful gardens. Many houses in Pompeii were arranged along narrow streets, often with a shop in front and living quarters in the rear. The sidewalks were higher than the street to keep people out of the mud. The public square at the center of the city was very grand, with temples and beautiful sculptures. Archaeologists even found the ruins of a bakery with round mills for grinding grain into flour and 81 loaves of bread still in the oven. But the most amazing thing you can see at Pompeii today are the plaster casts of bodies. 2,000 people out of a population of about 20,000 were trapped when the volcano erupted. The burning ash hardened as it cooled around their bodies. As archaeologists uncovered the holes, they filled them with liquid plaster which hardened into lifelike shapes. Now, the plaster casts of the people of Pompeii lie just as they did in their last moments of life. You can see why Pompeii is so exciting to archaeologists. But just think, When Mount Vesuvius blew its top, the Roman Empire was at the height of its power. It didn't start that way. So how did it get there? Now, on the timeline, oh yeah, this first picture reminds us of the myth the Romans had about the founding of their city. The story went like this. Mars, the god of war, fathered twin boys named Romulus and Remus. Their wicked uncle cast them adrift in the river Tiber. But a she-wolf found the babies and fed them with her own milk. The twins grew up to establish a great city on the spot where they almost drowned. Romulus became the first king of Rome. At first, Rome was ruled by a series of kings, but eventually they decided they wanted to choose their own leaders. They established a republic, a government with officials elected by the people. In fact, the word republic means people's thing. They had a senate and 2 consuls or rulers to share the power. In the central part of the city, called the Forum, the Romans built grand buildings to house their government. The people would gather here to talk to their leaders, to celebrate military victories, to shop, and to worship their gods. The Forum looks like this today, but imagine it filled with people and impressive buildings.
Our system of government owes a lot to the Romans. Our Senate is named after and even partly modeled after the Roman Senate. Our Capitol building in Washington, D.C. sits on Capitol Hill, named after the Roman Capitoline Hill. One of the basic concepts in our Constitution also came from the Romans. The idea of checks and balances. Each branch of the government, the president, the Congress, and the courts, has ways to limit the powers of other branches so no one branch can become too powerful. This idea of checks and balances was first used in the Roman Republic.
The Romans were great warriors. As time went on, they conquered more and more territory. Their victories brought riches to the state, but made Rome increasingly difficult to govern. In 49 BC, a general named Julius Caesar decided to seize total power. Caesar had won many victories, so he was popular with the people, but many senators felt his power had become too great. One day, they surrounded Caesar in the Senate and murdered him. The funny thing is that the senators' bloody deed did not restore the Republic. In fact, after years of civil war, Caesar's adopted son, Octavian, gained the complete power that Caesar himself had wanted. Octavian was crowned the first emperor of Rome, with the title Augustus. This altar shows a procession that includes the emperor and his family and friends. Augustus turned out to be an excellent ruler. He reformed the government and brought peace to the Roman world. That peace pretty much continued for 200 years, through good emperors and bad ones.
Any idea who created the calendar we still use today? You know, 365 days a year, 7 days a week, and so on? Well, it was the great Julius Caesar himself. Sort of. Actually, he brought the idea back from his travels in Egypt. Julius helped a lot with the names of the months. He named July after himself, for example. And, you guessed it, August was named after his adopted son, Augustus.
In the time of the emperors, the city of Rome was a lot like any big city, noisy and crowded with more than 1 million people. And in many ways, it functioned like a modern city too. Roman engineers were very clever. They developed sewers to dispose of waste and a complex system of aqueducts or channels to carry fresh water into the city, up to 250 million gallons a day. Most of the aqueducts were underground, but a few of the great arches, which also carried water, can still be seen today. They were built by the Roman army in times of peace. The arch became the Roman signature throughout the empire. Roman soldiers also built roads, at least 50,000 miles of paved ones, and many more which were unpaved. Some provide the basis for highway systems throughout Europe today. Of course, in ancient times, all roads led to Rome. In the great city itself, emperors commissioned grand arches and buildings to proclaim their power. One of the greatest remaining is a temple called the Pantheon. It was dedicated to all the Roman gods and goddesses, many of which the Romans adopted from the people they conquered, including the Greeks. The Romans were also inspired by Greek architecture, but they were practical builders and added ideas of their own. For example, the Pantheon has one of the largest single-span domes in the world. Guess what it's made of? An early form of concrete developed by the Romans. Because it was lighter than stone, concrete made it possible to build a dome as big as this one. In ancient times, the dome was covered with gleaming bronze. The opening at the top, called the oculus, was meant to symbolize the eye of heaven or the sun. Light coming through the oculus gives the building a different feeling all through the day. The Pantheon must have been built pretty well, because it has survived for more than 1,800 years. Now here's a good question for all you detectives. What does a landscape like this have in common with one like this? Both were part of the Roman Empire. Rome grew to dominate most of the Near East, North Africa, and Europe, becoming one of the mightiest empires in history. Why were the Romans so successful? Well, they made some smart moves. For one thing, they let people in the conquered territories become Roman citizens. That made them less likely to rebel, and it also brought good people into the government. The Emperor Hadrian, for example, came from Spain. Come in. Oh, hi, Steph. Stephanie is my detective in training.
Hi, Arizona. I left my book here earlier. What's this?
Well, I was just about to get into that when you so rudely interrupted. Actually, I was just starting to tell people about the Emperor Hadrian. Ever heard of him?
Isn't there some big thing named after him somewhere?
Very good. There's that big wall up in England near the Scottish border called Hadrian's Wall. Maybe you've seen pictures of it.
Yeah, I think I have.
Well, anyway, this piece of wood is like maybe 1,000 pieces archaeologists have found digging near the wall. But the ones up in England are special.
What do you mean? It doesn't look like much.
Well, no, it doesn't. But let me show you the pieces found in England. They may not look important, but these tiny little pieces of wood take us back nearly 2,000 years to life on the Roman frontier. In AD 122, the Emperor Hadrian decided that the Roman Empire had become big enough. He issued an order to his troops to build walls to show where the empire stopped and to protect its borders. In England today, near the Scottish border, much of Hadrian's mighty 73-mile-long wall survives, more than 1,800 years later. But that's not all. Archaeologists have been digging at the ruins of a nearby fort called Vindolanda, built by the Romans to house part of their border patrol. And guess what they found? An ancient trash heap. It may not sound like much, but to archaeologists, this can be the ultimate prize, full of clues to life long ago. archaeologists have uncovered Roman coins, pieces of pottery, even a baby's shoe. Objects like these make the Romans seem more like people than distant conquerors. But the most exciting discovery in this trash heap full of treasures doesn't look like much. The archaeologists uncovered tiny pieces of wood inscribed with Latin words, which disappeared almost as soon as they were exposed to the air. Luckily, the archaeologists realized that they could recover the words through infrared photography and chemical baths. Archaeologists have found more than 1,000 of these ancient tablets. Memos, lists of food and storage, personal letters between friends, including an invitation to a distant birthday party from one army wife to another.
That was really cool. I wish this piece had secret writing on it. But why did they write on wood? And why not on paper?
Well, the paper was really expensive in Roman times. Remember, it was made from papyrus plants, which had to be imported all the way from Egypt. And only the Chinese had paper made from trees, like our paper.
Oh, I'm late. Gotta run. See ya.
I'll see you, Steph. Hey, don't forget your book.
Want to hear something amazing? More than 1 billion people speak languages based on Latin, the Roman language. They include French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian. Lots of English words come from Latin too, like pedal, which comes from the Latin word pedes, which means feet, and computer, which comes from the Latin word computare, which means to calculate. How many others can you find?
Families were the foundation of Roman society, and your social class was determined by birth. If you were born into one of the small number of wealthy Roman families, you were considered part of the patrician class. Most of the people, including farmers and shopkeepers, were called plebeians. Both patricians and plebeians could vote, but patricians held most of the power. About a third of the people did not have any rights at all. They were slaves, many brought back from conquered lands. The patricians lived in elegant houses in wealthy towns like Pompeii, or clustered on the hills of Rome. In contrast, most of the city dwellers lived in cramped apartments in buildings sometimes 3 to 5 stories high. The poorest people lived on top. They had the most stairs to climb. Most of the apartments didn't have kitchens, so many people cooked in the streets. Water came from fountains in the public squares. And bathrooms were a communal experience. If you had time and could afford a small entrance fee, the place to hang out was the baths, a combination of health club and community center. Here, people could read, listen to poetry, catch up on gossip, buy fast food, play games, and get clean. The Romans didn't use soap. Instead, they rubbed themselves with olive oil, scraping the oil and dirt off with little sticks. There were as many as 900 public baths in ancient Rome, some holding nearly 2,000 people. The Romans took their favorite pastime with them to other parts of the empire as well. This computer animation shows some famous baths in southwestern England. Today, the town is still called Bath. After relaxing for a few hours at the baths, upper-class Romans would return in the late afternoon for their main meal of the day, while the peasants ate simply bread and vegetables, perhaps lentil soup. The wealthiest people often had feasts that would last for hours. Just like you see in the movies, wealthy Romans didn't sit at the dinner table. They often reclined on sofas. They were served by their slaves, who cut the food into little pieces eaten with the fingers. Take a look at a typical three-course dinner. First, olives or stuffed dormice, a real delicacy. Then maybe a whole pig, fish, and quail for the main courses, all washed down with wine. For dessert, there was cake and custard, fruit, and snails perhaps. Everyone brought napkins to stuff with food to take home, an ancient Roman doggy bag.
Guess when the fork finally appeared at the dinner table? 100 years after the Romans? 200 years? Try more than 1,000 years later. The fork was actually invented in Italy in the 11th century, but most people made fun of it. Eating with the fingers was considered far better manners. It was only a couple hundred years ago that most people started using forks. How do you think they ate spaghetti?
Hi, Caesar. You better behave. It's your big moment on camera.
Roman kids had lots of the same things we do. Pets like birds, cats, and dogs were very popular.
They played marbles, jacks, and hide and seek too.
Probably only rich kids went to school. But unlike most ancient cultures, at least some girls got educated.
What did they study? The same old stuff?
Yep. Reading, writing, and arithmetic. They'd write on wax-coated tablets with a sharp point called a stylus.
Hey, cool. Can I see that?
A Greek slave was often the teacher because the Romans wanted their kids to know what the Greeks knew.
A slave? Does that mean you can boss him around?
No way, he'd beat you if you misbehaved.
Ouch. School could be tough.
But it was better than getting married at 12 or 14, as most girls had to do. And often the husband's much older.
Yuck. Wealthy boys went to school until they were 16. Then they had a big party to celebrate becoming an adult. Hey, give me some help and I'll show you.
Okay.
Ta-da!
Now, you play my dad. Lead me to the forum where you sign my name to the list of citizens.
Something tells me women weren't allowed to vote.
Of course not. This is ancient Rome.
No wonder it fell to the barbarians.
In the city of Rome today, there's a place that can transport you back 1,800 years. You're there with the gladiators as they prepare for deadly combat. You can hear the echoes of the crowds. That place is the Colosseum. There are ruins of great arenas in many parts of the Roman world, but the most famous is the Colosseum in Rome. People of all classes attended the games, paid for by the emperor. 50,000 spectators could gather here. It was bigger than many arenas today. In ancient times, the exterior niches of the building held statues, and a great awning shielded the spectators on sunny days. Some scholars even think that the Romans would sometimes fill the Colosseum with water and stage sea battles. But the most popular events were the gladiator battles. Convicts or slaves would dress as warriors. When they filed past the emperor, they shouted, "We who are about to die salute you." If a gladiator survived 3 years in the ring, he was released, a star, like our sports heroes today. for hundreds of years, religious festivals, anniversaries, and military victories were all celebrated with bloody combat. In the last years of Imperial Rome, the emperors often sponsored gladiator games to distract the people from their troubles because things weren't going very well. Warlike bands of people from Northern Europe were nibbling at the borders, and Roman rulers were often corrupt and weak. An exception to this was the Emperor Diocletian, a really good administrator. He divided the empire into two parts, an eastern and a western part, each with its own emperor. For a while, his son, the great Constantine, united the empire again, but it didn't stay together for long. The western part, including the city of Rome, fell to the barbarians in the 5th century. The eastern part flourished for another 1,000 years. So, what do we make of ancient Rome? Despite its faults, the civilization lasted a long time. In fact, the Romans gave us the whole idea of civilization, which to them meant living in a city and not moving from place to place like the barbarians did. We owe a lot to the Romans. The layout of our cities, our great feats of engineering, many of the world's legal systems, all have their roots in ancient Rome. The Romans did borrow a lot from the Greeks in literature, theater, philosophy, and the arts, but they were practical and often developed the Greek ideas further. In fact, the cultures of Greece and Rome are so intertwined that they're often called Greco-Roman. So, the next time you see a Roman statue with a broken nose, give the culture some credit, okay? I mean, where would we be without them? See ya.